Hello, my name is Paul St. John. I'm the Clinical Director of Research at the St. John Clark Pain Treatment Center in Clearwater, Florida. And this message is directed to the millions of people who suffer from chronic pain that have not found resolution, although they've tried many different modalities. We're going to share with you what we consider one of the most important anatomical discoveries of the 21st century. In the literature, it's called leg length inequity. That means that you have one leg actually shorter, measurably shorter than another. The result of which is it imbalances the human structure from your toes to the top of your head. It causes many, many destructive patterns in the body, among them being herniated disc and ruptured discs. So we'll go through how to recognize this anomaly, which is considered one of the most common human anomalies in our anatomy. One of the most important pieces of research that we came across was done by Dr. Gary A. Knutson, and it was published in Chiropractic and Osteopathy in 2005. What this study revealed is that 41.3% of the population had between 0 and 4 millimeters of leg length difference. Actually, it was only 10% of the people walking around had no leg length difference at all. But that meant that 31.3% of the population had between 1 and 4 millimeters of leg length difference. The next category was 37.4% of this population had between 5 and 9 millimeters difference. The next category, and by the way, the greater the leg length difference, the more symptoms, the more severe the pain. So 15% of this population had between 10 and 14 millimeters of leg length difference. And the final category, 6.4%, had 14 or more millimeters. That's more than a half an inch. 12 millimeters is a half an inch. So it's a little more than half an inch of leg length difference. And that constant pounding, the average person takes around 10,000 steps a day. It's like having 10,000 mini whiplashes. And the results are devastating. We firmly believe if the information that you are going to learn in these few minutes was applied to the American population, that we could diminish the healthcare cost by hundreds of millions of dollars. That's just in dollars. But it's hard to put a price on a person's suffering. Let's talk to a real live person who suffered for years with chronic pain, even though she was an athlete, she was fit, and she was well known internationally.
Hi, I'm Sheila. I attended the Juilliard School and I ended up dancing professionally for 12 years. I toured internationally and I was very, very active, like Paul said, pretty much athletic level. And I started noticing the imbalance in my body pretty much right around college, right around maybe graduation time. And I noticed that I had this imbalance because of a leg length inequality, but I didn't know how to deal with it. So I went around to various therapists, massage therapists, physical therapists, chiropractors. I couldn't find ways to help my problem and deal with this leg length inequality. It wasn't until I retired, I moved back to St. Pete, and I found out that Paul St. John deals with leg length inequality. So I came here and the rest is history.
Okay, yeah, so we're going to just take some simple measurements. As Einstein said, if it can be measured, it's a fact. If it can't, it's a theory. So we don't guess with people's lives. We want to know exactly what's wrong to the millimeter. So let's do some simple measurements on Sheila, and then we'll look at her x-ray and find out what it revealed for us. So let's start by measuring the horizontal planes, and we'll start with the cranium because the closer we get to the brain, the more serious is the neurology. So we'll look at starting where balance and equilibrium, the labyrinth is in the inner ear, and follow the straight lines formed by my fingers. So I'm going to press in there, and that's the auditory canal, and you can see how the left is high and the right is low. And if you look very closely, you see if I put my finger under the orbital ridge in the middle, you see there's a difference there. Same thing with underneath her cheekbones and the jaw itself. And the lip line is slightly tilted. Then we go down to the shoulders and see the shoulder axis, and we'll use this joint right here, and you can see that there is a downward tilt. If we go further down the postural chain, now I don't know if you can see this, but I want to put my hands on the front of her shoulders and come away, and you can see that there's a rotation, that this shoulder is about that far in front of this shoulder. So that's a rotational distortion that occurs. If we come further down, the next three things we want to measure is the crest of the ilium, this point on the pelvis here called the anterior superior iliac spine, and this ridge here on the femur called the trochanter, because this represents the sum total of the two legs of the bone, the femur and the tibia. Extremely important. So I'll kneel down, find the crest of the ilium, so feel me on the bone there, and then here's the top of the bone here, and then I'll make a straight line. So can you see that difference that exists there? And then we'll go down and find the points on the pelvis. So here's the point, and there's a ridge below it. Here's the point, and there's a ridge below this. And you can see that everything is low on the right and high on the left. And the last measurement in the pelvis is this trochanter, this ridge pointing at the level of the femur. So let me find that ridge. So there's the two ridges. And you can see that everything is low on her right and high on the left, all three of those measurements. Next, we'll measure the top of the kneecap here and the top of the kneecap here. And you can see that that's pretty level. And there's an indentation here on the tibia called the tibial tuberosity. And we'll measure that. And you can see that that's level. So what does that mean? Let's chart this out so we can see what we've just measured. So now that we've charted and measured her body, let's look at what happens when we actually put it on paper and explain the results. So what we also did is measure Sheila in a lying down position, and what we saw here was that her heels were not even, but that the kneecaps were equally not even. They were both shifted like this. That meant that these were the same length. But when we went up here and measured her trochanters, the top of her hips, it was even. The point on his pelvis was even, and the tops of her pelvis was even, the crest of the ilium. Now what's going to happen when this person, what that tells us is that this femur is short. That's exactly what the standing measurements told us, that the femur was short. So when this person stands up, what would happen is all these planes gravity would push her down on the short leg side. The result was an S curve. So we'll look at the research of Dr. Janet Travell and David Simon, and what they say in their classic book on leg length inequity is that if you have 10 millimeters or more, you're going to have an S curve, and if you have 6 millimeters or less, you're going to have a C curve in the spine. So Sheila had an S curve. So what did these measurements mean in terms of inside your body? What happened?
Well, I had pain. I had a lot of hip pain. That was where a lot of my compensation was happening, right around both hip sockets. And I remember performing, and at the end of each show, I would have reverberating pain in my hips for hours and hours, and then it became more constant. A few times I had severe back spasms that put me out for several days on this side of my back. I had an area in between my shoulder blades that always felt kinked, like I really needed a chiropractic adjustment all the time. That's the only thing at the time I knew what to do. And
so when you got those adjustments, what happened?
I was afraid to walk home because I was afraid that it would go
out.
away.
Right.
So I didn't even want to move after each adjustment. So they were very short-lived.
Okay.
Yeah,
And this leads us to a mistake that we find all the time in the manipulative sciences. And that is, when we see a person whose leg length is different, that the heels actually don't meet when they're in a laying down position. And they'll get an adjustment, or in our case, we would stretch the muscles around the pelvis and the sacroiliac joint, and then pull the legs down, and they're even. But if we went up the postural chain, it would be like they were standing up. They would be crooked. But people don't do that. So they come to the assumption that it's the result of the pull of muscles and not actually a structural difference. And that difference is important to analyze. And the only way you can do it is to actually measure these different bones, these two bones, and see what happens in the pelvis. So the result is that you can have some form of muscular manipulation or osseous manipulation, but it's short-lived. And it's short-lived because what we want to see is that all these lines need to be horizontal all the way down the postural chain. So let's look at what we did to document this with standing radiography. Now, the protocols we use for taking the X-ray are very important, and they come from this incredible book by Dr. Janet Travell and Dr. David Simons, Myofascial Pain and Dysfunction, a Trigger Point Manual, Volume 2, Chapter 4. And what they explain about the X-ray is very important, because there's a reason why leg length inequity is so underdiagnosed. And that is how the X-rays spray out of the X-ray tube or the cathode tube. They spray out like this. So the most accurate part of any X-ray is that central horizontal beam. And where we want to put that is right over Sheila's hips, so the ball and socket, and not over the spine. That's the biggest mistake being made by taking X-rays of the spine, because we want to look at the difference between the ball and sockets. If you were trying to measure my shoulders to see if they were even, you'd put your eyes on the level of my shoulders. Well, the same thing. Each X-ray that we take, the beam has to be put over the ball and socket and not over the spine. If you put the central beam up here, by the time it disperses, this is called a parallax distortion, and gets down to the ball and socket, it makes them look even or less distorted. That's extremely important to understand. And the latest research that I want to share with you comes from a university in Turkey. This is a 2016 study by the Department of Neurosurgery. And this is its title. The inequity in leg length is important for the understanding of the pathophysiology of the lumbar disc herniation. So this is documenting what we've known for a long time, is as those vertebrae tilt and wedge like that, they cause disc herniation and ruptured discs and lead to surgery and untold amounts of human misery. So let's take a look at an X-ray taken properly of Sheila and what it reveals to us. So the most important measurement here, if we take this T-square and we put it on the top of this ball and socket and draw a straight line across, and then we do it on the top of the other ball and socket and draw a straight line across, and then we measure this distance, it comes out to 16 millimeters difference. So Sheila has been walking around with a 16 millimeter leg length difference. And it was only because she was such a good athlete and stretched every day, as dancers do, and did yoga, and kept her body supple, that she was able to function. But you see this plane here going up like this, and then you see the spine angle going off like that. I circled this because these are the facet joints, and that white density, the opaqueness, is arthritis. And then you see it caused a 6 millimeter difference in the top of the sacrums here, and a 13 millimeter difference in the top of the crest. So that's why we were able to measure these differences so easily when the person was standing up, as my fingers were like this, able to see that, and then the points on the pelvis, able to see that, and then the trochanters down here, and able to see this difference. So this creates wear patterns. This is the formation. Notice that this ball is exceeding the limits of the socket, so the body's going to create a spur to try to keep that into the socket, because this is pushing up so hard that it's pushing out of the socket, straining the ligaments, the ligamentous capsules, the ischiofemoral ligaments and the iliofemoral ligaments. And that was the source of her pain in her hips. Now also it's worth noting that the cartilage on the inside, the non-weight bearing, is very thick. But notice when we get to where the ball meets the socket, the cartilage is getting very thin here, and even more so on the short leg side. So that is what leads to hip replacements because of wearing this hip out. It's important to understand, be able to interpret this information, and now let's talk about correcting this leg length inequity. So now if we look at the results we saw from Sheila's x-rays, now we know why her pelvis was positioned like this, and all these measurements were tilted to the right the way they were. Now here comes the most important part, how to correct this, because the body likes balance and equilibrium. And this is where you can see why this is rarely done, because you can't slide 16 millimeters inside a shoe. Your heel will come out of the shoe. So this is the shoe of a person who had chronic migraines. And you see we use a full foot lift. That is, the transverse metatarsal arch has to be lifted as well as the heel. Yet what is still commonly used is heel lifts. But what a heel lift does is create a torsion in the pelvis. Let me show you that so you understand. It's called anteversion. If we hike up just one ilium like this happens. Rotation. It's like wearing only one high heel. If you wore one high heel, this would happen. If you wore two high heels, this would happen. It creates more pelvic flexion, or anteversion as it's called. So when you put a heel lift to correct a horizontal distortion, what happens is this. Now notice what's happening to the spine. So you may have a spine that tilts to the right, you put a heel lift, and now it's going to tilt to the left and create a whole new set of symptoms. So you have to have something that lifts the pelvis in order so all the spine can be straight and all these horizontal planes are horizontal. And to do that, it takes effort, it takes a team. We have to find a cobbler, first of all, that works in millimeters and not inches, because they're more accurate. To lift up the foot. The difference between these two shoes, as you can see the difference, but that's a difference of a young man who had chronic migraines. Now I want to explain that to you, because that is something that's commonly misunderstood. See, in the cervical area, when we look at this model, you see from C3 down to C7 and 8 that the nerves fit in these little U-shaped troughs in the tubercles. But these upper two nerves don't. They fit in this little U-shaped groove in the base of the cranium. So when the cranium tilts, like we saw with Sheila on the right side like that, what is happening is this. And when your cranial base hits that nerve, that's the source of chronic headaches, chronic tension, and some little muscles that are shaped like a triangle called the occipital triangle. 3 little muscles that control the movement of the atlas, this upper vertebrae. This is happening. And that is a result that leads to chronic pain. If it's a rotoscoliosis, it can lead to the entrapment of this artery, the vertebral artery, which is the only artery in the human body encased in bone like that. Nature did that for a reason, because it goes up to a little circle here called the circle of Willis that provides blood to the brainstem and all these control mechanisms in the brainstem. So this is why so many people have chronic headaches that have no resolution through medication, because underlying it is this most important discovery of leg length inequity. So let's look at some more shoes, and you can see that it takes some effort. Here's a pair of flip-flops, and you can see the difference where the actual lift is built into the flip-flop. That's important. The same thing with sandals, because if it's 6 millimeters or less, you can slide it inside the shoe. But if it's 6 millimeters or more, this is a pair of Sheila's shoes, and you can see the lift is built into her right shoe in order for these horizontal planes to become horizontal. Any shoe can be done if you have a talented cobbler. Here, for example, is a pair of platform shoes. You don't see the lift, but it's built in. Nobody sees these lifts. They're colored properly. We have a team that we work with in order to do these shoes. Now you can see why most people are not going to go through this effort until enough people understand why it is a must. Not that we should, we must do this. We can't guess with your brainstem. And so let's look at Sheila when she is fully lifted and what happens in her structure. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take a 6 millimeter lift and a 10 millimeter lift and put it together. This is what Sheila needs to be to balance. So we're going to put this 16 millimeters underneath her foot. And let's take these measurements again and see what happens. Well, again, we'll start up here and we'll look at the orbital ridges, and you see they've become level. You see the cheeks. Now I'll place my fingers in the auditory canal and press up against the bone. That pretty smile is now becoming level. Here is the bottom of her jaw. You see her shoulders. Go down to the pelvis and find the top of the pelvis, the crest of the ilium as it's called, and press there, and you can see that that's nice and level. We'll go to the points on the pelvis right here, and there's a ledge underneath, and you see that's become level. And as we go down to the trochanters on the femur, and we press down on the top of the trochanters, you can see that's level. And now, as these are level, tell us what's happened to your life since you're now walking around level.
All the places that I had discomfort and pain that became chronic literally disappeared. When I put the lift in, I don't feel the pressure in my back. I don't feel the kink. I don't feel the reverberating pain. It's instant relief. And the hips, now over time, I've been in a lift for 5 years now, no pain at all. I mean, it's amazing. I knew I was on the road to a hip replacement, so this has changed my life.
How long did it take for that chronic pain in your hip to go away? Can you remember?
Not long at all.
No, it was like
pretty quick.
4 or 5 or 6 therapy sessions, and then releasing the chronic spasms. And the result was that because she was well trained, now if you're 80 years old, it's going to take a lot longer than it took Sheila. But the fact that her stretches, her lifestyle now leads to balance and equilibrium, leads to a pain-free life if there's a structural abnormality present.
Another interesting thing that happened, Paul, is the bone spur on my left acetabulum is no longer there. So we've had 2 other x-rays since the original one, and
Yes, and we'll show you those x-rays so you can see that, because the body then sends enzymes and dissolves that calcium because that lip to hold the ball into the socket is no longer there. There's not that pushing up force on the left and the pushing down force on the right. So I want to thank YouTube for providing this educational forum for which we can share with you what we firmly believe is one of the greatest anatomical discoveries of the 20th century, leg length inequity. Please check this out if you're a person who's in chronic pain, because it can cause pain from your cranium all the way down to your feet and ankles. Thank you for your attention, and we've really enjoyed sharing this information with you.